For him specifically, one, it goes back to what I just talked about, the idea of mapping all of the Italy planes, figuring out where everything was. We got, specifically for him, we got one of those reports from a third party in late 2011, early 2012, where they said there's a physics professor in Austria named Roland Domen, who was really, really into World War II aircraft. He wrote to us about a separate plane in northern Italy near Brunico. We identified that pilot, but he wrote us to say, hey, I know where this plane is. It's P-38 in northern Italy. Can someone come check it out? And that filtered over to me as the person who was working on planes in Italy. And we had started to set a plan for that first trip to Italy. And that was one of the focal cases that we wanted to do. We wanted to go work on this one that Roland had reported to us. So because we were going to be in that part of Italy, I started to go through those maps that I'd made the 2 years prior to try to find other planes that might have crashed close to that. So what I wanted to do is plan the trip in a way that made it a cluster. The less we have to drive around, the more we can do out of one place, the more efficient we are. The more stuff we can do. So I came across Captain Dickson's case there because he went missing along the border of Italy and Austria. The missing aircrew report at the time listed him as being missing Monteroghetto and Tarvisio, Italy, right on the border. So it was close enough. So I started to go through more records. That sent me back to the archives to try to find more. And this was right around the time that we had just tapped into another resource at the National Archives that we did not know about previously, which was the captured German records. So we won the war, to the victors go the spoils, and lucky for us, some of those spoils were military records that the Germans had, and they're in our archives in Washington, D.C. And there's a whole subset of them called the Downed Allied Aircraft Reports. And those were reports of German shoot-downs. The Germans said, we shot a plane down here. This is where the pilot was. This is who we captured. This is who's dead. And so that was a brand new set of records for us back in 2012. And I thought, well, let's just look at those for the day that Captain Dickson went missing and see if they reported anything that day. And they did. They reported a P-51 Mustang that crashed in Hohenturn, Austria, which is right across the border from that Monteroghetto, Tarvisio area that I was talking about. So we looked at that. Very, very few planes of that type crashed on that day, and even fewer crashed in that part of the world on that day. So we had a pretty good sense that that was the right plane. So we didn't know exactly where in Hohenturn, and since the guy that I was just talking about, Roland, since Roland lived in Austria, I wrote to Roland and said, hey, we definitely want to come over and work on the other case in Northern Italy with you, but since you're into this stuff, have you ever heard anything about a P-51 crash in Hohenturn? And Roland wrote back and said, no, I've never heard anything of that, but I can go down there this weekend and ask around. So he did. So he went to the town that I told him about, and a few days later I got an email from Roland saying, I found the plane that you were talking about. I found somebody who knows all about it. So we put that one on the list of cases to investigate, and we had to work with the Austrian government to hop over the border from Italy into Austria, because that was supposed to just be an Italy mission, but they worked great with us. And so for one day, the whole thing took a day. We stayed in Italy one night, and the next morning we drove over the border and met a man who lived in the town and grew up very close to the plane crash. And a little kid. He's an engineer now. You could tell when we went to his house, he had all these cars in his garage that he works on. So he's a mechanical kind of guy, and he was like that as a kid. And he heard about this plane crash when he was a boy, and he would go out to it to try to find plane parts. And at one point, he went out when he was around 10 or 11 years old, and while he was trying to piece the plane, he said he found a bone. He said maybe it wasn't. He said that he found a femur. It scared him. He buried it. He never went back there again. The first time he ever went back to the plane crash was when he took Roland there. And then the second time that he ever gone back was when he took me there, me and a couple of my colleagues. So he knew exactly where it was. When we showed up, there were a couple of older residents of the town that were there. He remembered the day that it happened, remembered everything that happened. They went out there. And it was just so clear once we got out. Once we got out into the middle of the woods, there was a big open clearing next to it, and then a bunch of pine trees. It's been 11 or 12 years, and it is still one of my favorites. It's weird to say that you have a favorite crash site you've ever been on, but it's just, you're so sure. You are so sure you are on a crash site, because there were some parts everywhere. It was, like I said, a bunch of pine trees, so there were pine needles everywhere. And if you just kicked some of the pines off the ground, you just see parts of the plane everywhere. And then where the plane had hit when it was on fire, the machine gun bullets had all kind of popped off in the fire. And some of the pine trees, the older pine trees around it, had scars, and all the pine could see where the bullets hit the pine trees. I remember it so vividly. Like you were just so clearly on a crash site. and then just realizing right at that moment, oh, found the Tuskegee Airman's plane crash. That's going to be a big deal. Do that right away. So in all honesty, like this one particularly, because of the German records and because of the help that we had from Roland in Austria, this felt like one of the easier ones. One of the really cool things about this one in particular for me is normally when you're a researcher in DPAA, you don't get to spend as much time with the family as maybe you'd want to once everything is over. But because this was such a big news story when it came out, it was the front page of the Washington Post, it was in the Smithsonian Magazine, it was everywhere. I kept getting put in positions where Captain Dickson's daughter, Marla Andrews, and I kept being put in places together. She was in the documentary, The Last B-24. She was a portion of that documentary. And they had a big premiere of that at the World War II Museum the night that it aired. And there was a panel. So they did the premiere, and then there was a panel. So she and I both ended up on that panel. So I got to spend that time with her. At one point, DPAA brought her and her family here during a meeting of the whole staff here in DC. She spoke to all of us. So I got to meet her on several occasions, and then at the funeral at Arling's, buried at Arling's. So I've had a chance to talk to her and be around her and her children, so Captain Dickson's grandchildren. I've been around them a lot more than I normally am with other family members. So that's been really, really nice. For Marla in particular, from all the times that I've talked to her, there were a couple of really big things. So she was around 1.5 years old when her dad went missing. And there's actually a letter in one of the files that her mother wrote to the War Department about getting his electric guitar back. He was a jazz musician in New York before he joined the Army, before he became a pilot. And so there's a whole thing in there about, can we get his electric guitar back? I don't think they ever got his electric guitar back. The end of that letter says, and can you tell me anything about what happened? Because my daughter is 1.5 years old and I don't know what to say to her. She's starting to ask about her dad. So knowing that she grew up with a whole life of wondering anything about her dad and trying to grasp at straws for any story about her dad. Later on, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Martin, who was one of the Tuskegee Airmen who was flying with him when he went missing, he wrote her a letter about everything that happened. And when she came to DPAA and to visit us all, and she got up and talked for all of us, right before that, she brought the letter in and asked if someone would let her out loud to everybody. So it ended up being me. But I read the letter from Robert Martin saying this is what happened. But Robert Martin didn't have the whole story, right? Because he was in the air at 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 feet, wherever he was when he saw it. The person who had the rest of the story was me. So I was there, found him. And she always says that, right? That Robert Martin knew everything about her dad. And the oddest part about it is that right before, the day before we identified Captain Dickson, Robert Martin died. So and he knew that we were close, and he knew that we had already been to the site and those kinds of things. The story had already come out. But then for Marla, in that moment, she would tell me that I was kind of taking his place, because it went from this person who knew what happened to her dad to now it's me that knows what happens to her dad. So she lost Robert Martin, but she gained me, and she constantly calls me her forever friend. And I get cards from her periodically that come through the Pentagon. I'll just come into work every once in a while, and there'll be a card from Marla on my desk, which is so nice. Still, like years later, that still happens. Her daughter Amber told me a couple of years ago that finding Captain Dickson really changed her mom in a really positive way. That she's just happier. She knows all this stuff now. It just made her a happier